Okay, so we are recording, and then after our speaker, we will have more information for you. Good now.
We introducing or we're just welcoming?
Introducing.
Oh, okay. Everybody, okay, so I'm thrilled to introduce Justine Kilby-Janssen, who was born and raised in Chatham-Kent, but now lives in London with her husband Eric and 3, soon to be 4 kiddos. And Justine and I met, well, a while ago, but we got a chance to get to know each other better when she got a place in Rondo, which is exciting, and also few seminars, COVID, we talked online. It's just a blur the last 2.5 years, but Justine has some really exciting projects on the go, and I don't want to steal any thunder, so I'm going to welcome her to the podium, but Justine is one of the trailblazing leading women in this region, and I'm thrilled she can join us today. So please welcome Justine Janssen.
All right, thank you so much for having me. As Brett mentioned, I do have some slides, so if anyone is interested in learning more about some of the ideas we're going to talk about today, you're welcome to take a look at those, but I'm also always happy to have lunch or have a coffee chat or whatever it is, because building community, building thriving communities, particularly down here in Southwestern Ontario, is extremely important to me. I was actually introduced to the idea of community stewardship and what it takes to build a thriving community from a previously local Chatham woman, Kathleen Cabani, back in the 90s, I think. And it was something that I got really excited about, and just the idea that a few people could make a really huge impact in terms of the trajectory of a community through thoughtful stewardship. Was something that I got really energized by. So in our 15 minutes or so together, what I wanted to do is just introduce you to a couple of ideas or twists on how we really build a strong foundation for Chatham-Kent, or really, I think these are things that are important to any community, particularly small and mid-sized ones like ours. And then to the extent that there are ideas that are interesting to you, then there's lots of threads that we can pull to learn more about them, and I'd be happy to talk your ear off about them at any time. So as Allison said, I grew up here in Chatham. Originally thought I'd come back to be a GP. I always wanted to be a doctor, but I realized when I was at Western that I didn't like pain. And so as much as I loved the academic side of it, it turned out that maybe I wouldn't be such a good doctor. So I went back to my roots, which was I liked starting businesses and different things when I was growing up here. And so I went the business route and grew tech companies over the last couple of decades. So that took me all over North America. Eventually, my husband decided to come back to the public sector, and he teaches at Western, which is why we live there. But Chatham-Kent has always held us and supported us, and I just have so much love for this community. People invested in me every step of the way, whether it was giving me my first jobs or coaching sports or buying from my businesses. My family has started companies here locally and had an opportunity to build success and build careers for other people that way. And the community here has always been a place where if you have an idea or you have energy, people will come around you and lift you up and help you out. And I just think that's tremendously special and also unique. I don't think that that's the case in all communities. Certainly hasn't been our experience in different cities that we've lived in, but it's very special here in Chatham-Kent. Is something that I really love about the region, and also why I'm so, I think, invested in its long-term success. So today I wanted to talk about 2 themes, one of which is, both of which are tied to the foundation of building thriving community. So there's kind of a pyramid that I think about when it comes to building community, where the first part of building a strong community is I don't think this would be surprising to any of you, but a really strong foundation of economic and social security, right? If people can't afford to live, or they don't have, you know, basic health or other needs covered, they can't really build connections or participate in the arts or in sports or in other things that enrich their lives and really create the belonging that really enriches our community. So I'm really interested in, like, how do we build that base, that foundation, that economic security that will enable us to really build a thriving community on top of it. And the two ideas that I wanted to talk about with you today are, one, talent. How do we retain talent differently here? I know that talent retention in Chatham is not a new concept. Back to CK and others, we've been talking about it for a long time. But I want to talk about a different way to retain talent and get people to launch their careers here. Talent being the fuel that runs our economic engine, and then how we think about businesses and keeping businesses local, particularly the ownership, the wealth, and the control of them, as sort of the engine that fuel supports. So talent and the businesses are the two ideas that I wanted to share with you today. And to the extent that they're interesting, we can certainly expand on them. So the first one is retaining talent through modern apprenticeships, something Allison and I have had a chance to talk a little bit about. But communities across the country, not just Chatham, of course, are facing growing labor shortages. So in the last couple of years, I've been meeting with economic development partners across the country, and we're learning about really massive gaps, thousands of employee gaps in terms of what the communities need, not to grow their companies, but just to maintain the businesses that they have. Because the reality is, in communities with under 500,000 people here in Canada, there's about 68 people entering the workforce right now for every 100 exiting. So we have this hugely painful reverse flywheel impact happening in our communities. So you would think that we're snapping up every single young person that comes out of school, right? But that's not the case. And that's, I think, the part that's the most wild to me, is we have all these young people coming out of school, particularly our university system, who end up unemployed or underemployed for extended periods of time. And so, like, why? Like that's crazy, right? Like we have this huge need, the community has a huge need, and yet there's kids living in their parents' basements longer than ever before, and what's going on? And the reason for that is because we traditionally leave it up to employers to source their own talent. We don't support the new graduates very well. In Canada, we have work integrated learning, so co-op opportunities that are focused on the areas that are actually also the most in demand, like engineering, for example. So those people typically are the most likely to be employed, and we also spend about $1 billion a year giving them work experience, which is kind of wild. And then on the flip side, we have employers who are always looking at that same pool, right? We're looking for trades, engineers, computer science for the most part. But that leaves us with a whole bunch of students that are graduating from other programs who aren't necessarily being supported with employment services. Because typically, to access employment services once you graduate, you have to have been unemployed for a long time. So this gap. And so what happens in communities like Chatham is we have kids, they graduate and they say, well, there's nothing here for me. I don't know what's here. I don't meet the 5 years of work requirement or the technical requirements that the employers have. And we have employers saying there's no talent. And so in the last couple of years, with some friends of mine, we started a program called the Canadian Career Apprenticeship Initiative. And through that program, just through private donations at this point, what we've been doing is we've been providing employers in mid-sized cities with 3 to 4 months of wages for hiring new graduates from non-traditional backgrounds. So arts programs, things like English degrees, business degrees, actually, psychology, you name it. And at the same time, we're teaching those individuals, those new graduates, how their skills can be applied in these jobs where they wouldn't necessarily have been recruited before. And the benefit of that program, of course, is that these young people are getting into jobs that they wouldn't have necessarily traditionally been recruited into, but they're building their lives in those communities. So we've seen people get engaged, to be married. It's only been around for a few years, so hopefully we'll see some marriages, but buying houses and really embracing the communities that we're operating in. To date, we've been leveraging economic development and the city infrastructure as well as universities to help us run the program. But I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't do something like that here in Chatham. So the idea I want to leave you with in terms of talent retention is that our experience is sometimes it takes a little bit of extra effort to make the matches in ways that don't necessarily seem the most natural, but we've got huge need on both sides. And we just have to think about how we match them a little bit differently. So to me, one of the questions is how do we work with local businesses here in CK to retain young talent, and how do we support them? Because asking the businesses to do it themselves when they have a million things going on and don't necessarily know how they're going to train them or what have you, and also aggregating the demand is something that we can work together to do. So that's idea one, which is the talent one. The other one I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce you to is on the business side. So we know that about 70% of business owners in Canada are looking to transition within the next 5 to 10 years, which is a really terrifying number to me, because it means that all of those companies are in a state of flux. And it's also a big opportunity for us to really think about how we help those entrepreneurs transition in a way that we can support that community asset moving forward. So when we look at our local entrepreneurs, people who are looking to retire or move on from their company, they're typically left with 3 options when it comes to moving, when it comes to succession. One is to find a financial buyer. So someone like a private equity company, that capital typically comes from the US. So now all of that wealth and control is left the community. It's now in the States. The second is a strategic buyer. So they go to a competitor, generally also not someone from the community, hopefully Canadian at least, but generally not, could be from a different international place. Or the third option is if there is no like economically accretive option for the entrepreneur is to shut down, right? So option 1 and 2, traditionally, Chatham Kent Economic Development and all of us would say is a success, right? Because the doors stayed open. We didn't lose any jobs, everything's good. But what we find, and we've all experienced it, I mean, seen lots of businesses transition and close both here and in London and other places where we've lived, is that the job of the new owners is to maximize returns. So we're going to try to compress wages or do whatever we can to get as much profitability out of those companies as possible. And our responsibility to our shareholders is if we can make the money, if we make more money somewhere else, we'll shut it down and we'll do that. And I myself have been in the position a number of times in my career where I've spun offices up and down in communities I've never stepped foot in. And it's really easy to do that on paper, right? Because you've never met the families that are supported by them, and you've never really seen the implications on a community. And that's really just because those people don't live there and they're not beholden to the community or care about legacy. So the idea that I want to introduce you all to around succession is community-owned businesses. In the recent 2022 budget, Canada announced something very, very exciting, which is the introduction of an employee ownership trust. So we've always had options for broad-based ownership in Canada. They haven't been, I don't think, broadly communicated to most owners. They include things like co-ops, moving to nonprofit, social enterprise, things like that. But through this new trust structure that's been announced this year, we now have the ability to transition ownership to the employees of a company and essentially spread wealth in the community, and do so while still retaining the structure of the company so it can continue to operate the way that it did. And when an owner transitions the company to an employee ownership trust, it allows them to do so at fair market value. So they can actually use debt financing and other instruments to transition their company in a way that they get the financial reward, and they still can structure the company in the way that's made it successful to date. So that's pretty cool, right? You think about legacy and being able to support the employees that have helped you build. This now puts you in a position where the company's not going to leave. Employee-owned businesses tend to be way more resilient than non-employee ones. Employee owners tend to be 92% more wealthy in terms of the wealth that is created. And the good news for us is there's lots of models of this in the US and in the UK. In the US, actually, the most popular place for employee-owned companies is Ohio, not too far from us. And there's over 6,000 employee-owned companies there. The UK recently adopted employee ownership models and had 200 companies just this past year transition. So for us, I think this is a real big opportunity for us to think about succession, not just in terms of, hey, did the company stay open, but how can we make sure that the wealth and the control and the growth and prosperity of our economic engine stays local? So that is my second idea that I want to talk to you about in terms of retention. And my ask would be, if you know anyone, because you probably all know people, since such a large percentage of our entrepreneurs are looking to transition, that might benefit from learning more about some alternatives so we can keep our businesses local. I'm happy to buy them lunch and talk to them about alternatives, and help them with things like even leadership succession, so that we can make sure that we really secure that foundation. So 2 ideas in a short amount of time. If anyone has any questions, I don't know that I have time for them. Oh, I do. Yeah. Okay, I can take questions.
Any questions?
Do you know of any local examples of employee ownership?
Yeah, so the employee ownership trust structure isn't active in Canada yet, but there are options of co-ops. So there's actually a company right now in Guelph, Henry's Tempe, that's going through the co-op structure. The difference between an employee ownership trust and a co-op structure is, in a co-op structure, each employee has an equal amount of ownership. So you do tend to run the company a little differently than you did in the past, in that it's much more democratized. But they're also great examples of where you've now spread the wealth across multiple people. In terms of employee ownership owned companies that you would probably know about, Publix, which is a grocery store down in Florida, they've had people retire from the grocery store with $1 million worth of equity, which is incredible, right? It's life-changing money. The average employee owner has over $100,000 worth of equity in the US, which is really life-changing wealth for a lot of people. Gore-Tex, like the jackets, Cliff Bars, there's lots, like the Taylor guitars, they kind of exist among us, if you will. But a lot of those entrepreneurs were in a position where they were really thinking about legacy and community and how we move the business forward in a way where it could exist 100 years from now, instead of having that risk of the company kind of being totally out of your control and taken in whatever direction the new owners wish. So I think it's a good opportunity for us to consider, and certainly one that, as citizens, we would want to make sure entrepreneurs at least know about.
Andy?
Yes.
Yes, I was wondering, you talked about the graduates
Yeah.
you have at university. I have more concern with the people going into university. And it seems to me that there's a group there that your type of presentation doesn't get to. These kids that are graduating from high school, and yes, I'm going to go to university, I'm going to take philosophy.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do? Who's going to hire you when you're done? That kind of thing. And to me, unless you do something in university that's going to get you a job when you get out, why bother going to university? Why don't you just go to a community college and get a trade? I think that there's got to be more influence on going into university.
Yeah.
Because I hate to say it, but they're influenced, for instance, by the teachers who teach them, who most of them are educated in philosophy, and they like the teacher and they like to do what their teacher did. Well, I mean, when I went to high school, the subject was Latin, and people took Latin. Why would you? I mean, why in the world would you do something like that? And I'd like to see the emphasis put back on the group of kids that are going into university and get them at that point, so they go into engineering or they go into something that's useful.
We need arts grads too there. I mean,
They need what?
we need arts grads and social science grads too.
Not as much as some people would like to have.
I disagree.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an ongoing debate around what's university for, and how do we enable people to, build economic security for themselves in the veins of areas they want to study. But to your point, there's also a lot of organizations. I participate on the board of one that's out of Windsor called Build a Dream, and their whole focus is how do we educate actually primarily parents on the value of a degree in trades, on the value of going into law enforcement, on the value of being in the public sector and other areas where there's a lot of demand. And they're particularly focused on bringing women into those fields because there's such a low percentage participation and they're very, very lucrative careers. So I think there is a lot of work trying to help kind of debunk some of the myths of what, frankly, what I think a lot of college degrees can do for you, because they can be tremendously lucrative and successful careers that some families just haven't had as much exposure to. So I think there is a lot of work being done there to try to broaden the options for people. But to your point, I think what we're trying to do with CCAI is say, hey, someone with a philosophy degree has an extremely great skill set on their own, and they can be super motivated and organized and have great critical thinking and communication skills and a whole host of skills that are useful to our local companies. We may just have to spend some time teaching them in kind of specific vocations. And can we as a community help fund that so that we can take some of the barriers out of getting them into meaningful work that have existed because of the ways that we've traditionally thought of recruiting people. But yeah, there's definitely huge mismatches right now in terms of what people are going to school for and what employers are demanding.
Paul, and then Peter.
So those two ideas you brought forward today are both great ideas. And how do you implement that? Sounds to me like you need to have some sort of government action.
I mean, obviously, it's a great question. So how do you implement the ideas? I mean, for me, obviously, I have a huge amount of bias in that I think they should be funded and should totally be part of our government policies and what they support in communities. Like I'd 100% love every economic developer everywhere to be talking about co-ops and EOTs. And some of what I'm doing is just trying to educate people on things that exist so that they can go and tell businesses about them. So to your point, in terms of implementation, for me, the biggest thing we can do right now is twofold. So let's talk about the business one and then the talent one. On the business side, it's make sure our economic developers and our community leaders are aware of the options that are available to them. I had never really understood broad-based ownership or employee ownership as a viable option for succession until someone taught me about it. So I take meetings with anyone to educate them on these options so that hopefully they bump into somebody over wine at dinner and educate them. And so I think with EOTs coming to Canada, a lot more of our legal and accounting infrastructure and stuff, people will start to know about it and be able to guide their clients that it's an option. But I think a lot of what we can do is just start to educate people more broadly that there are more options available to them than selling to a competitor or selling to a private equity company. So that I think is the approach there. And I don't think, and also on there are groups like Social Capital Partners and others here in Ontario and in Canada who are helping, and myself, who are helping to pull the pieces together, right? So that if you had a friend or knew somebody or you had a business that you wanted to look at transitioning, we'll help you, whether it's through the Ivy Business School, training up your staff so that they can become kind of the leader succession pieces of it, and we'll help you with the legal structures and kind of getting the people together that you need to actually do a transaction. That's certainly hustle that I'm happy to do because I think it has great returns. On the talent side, with CCAI, like I said, that's a small group of private people getting private dollars together to do something we feel is really important. And our hope is, so we're actually working with the Smith School of Business in Kingston to do a study to calculate the actual return on investment that CCAI is making, to show a community that, hey, if you put the equivalent of 3 to 4 months salary upfront, and maybe in a community like Chatham Kent, it doesn't have to be that much money, I don't know, but say it's 10 grand. If we invest that in a new graduate to get them started in their career and help the employer get them trained, what's the return to the community on that? And so, I mean, ideally, I'd love to see will dollars or other dollars get moved toward this type of effort. But I think in the meantime, we can use seed capital, if you will, from the community to prove that out. And so that's what we're doing. We have about 100 students that have gone through so far. So I think we've proven the base model, and now we're trying to figure out, well, like, how do we scale it, and what does it look like in a community like Chatham that doesn't have a host university? And I think just getting interested parties together and finding the places where we can start to move the system is the starting point.
And Peter, and then Eric.
Let's sort of follow up on what Andrew was saying, and it's a bit of an anecdote first.
Yeah.
Back in 1998, 99, the Liberal federal government had this program where we brought in a high-tech worker, spouse got a work permit as well, a 2-for-1 special.
Mm-hmm.
And the Reform Party, the opposition at the time, was against this. And so high-tech people, I was a high-tech university model. We arranged a breakfast with Preston Manning to talk about sense into his head. And he asked the question, why do we need to bring people in from abroad? And it made me think for some time. He's a classical economist. He was wondering, what was the market failure from his point of view? Yeah. And that was causing this problem. In our company, for example, we've got a lot of people from both France and Brazil. It's kind of weird. And I was thinking about that. Well, basically, there are 2 areas of market failure. One is the feedback from the companies to the university. Mm-hmm. All the computer scientists get hired, and none of the philosophers, also get hired. There's nothing in there that's going to change the university's approach in the number of professorships in philosophy versus computer science. And so there's a market failure there. There's a market failure at the high school level. Well, back then, you got this little book which said you get into computer science, computer engineering, wanted to be 95% average, and you get into sociology, running 75% average. So there is actually a market indication, but nothing really happens. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you're somehow trying to sort of affect this so that universities can respond more to the world around you.
I mean, yeah, it's loaded in a bunch of ways. It comes back to the question of like, well, what's university for, and how should public dollars support or not support it? I mean, as the spouse of someone who works at a university and hears the ongoing arguments, I understand that it's complicated, as most things are, right? But I think with CCAI, what we're trying to do with the Career Apprenticeship Initiative is say, okay, like, existing in the existing ecosystem, what can we actually do and how can we support? And to your point around like there are ways that I think from a policy perspective, they are trying to move universities, at least in Ontario, now to a more outcomes-based model where some of their funding is based on how many students actually get placed into jobs. And I really like that because regardless of what someone chooses to take in terms of their major, what's been clear to us with the work that we've been doing and trying to launch careers for these new graduates is that there is this gap. Like we're to date, the universities are like, our job is to educate you, and when you leave, you don't belong to us anymore. So good luck, right? And then the community is like, oh, too bad you don't have a job. But no one is in the middle trying to grab this community asset. Like, if there's one thing you go away with today for me, it's that we think of these young people and we think of businesses as assets, like really valuable gems in our community that we should be paying attention to and trying to foster. I mean, there's the normal business things like buying local and supporting our local entrepreneurs and trying to help them, because running a business is freaking hard. And even before they sell, there's lots we can do to try to support our local economy. But the kids too, like that we would just leave this gem of talent to fend for itself somehow and probably drive down the 401 to Toronto to grab a job it's a lost opportunity. So yeah, like, does the system work properly today? No. Are there ways we could be more efficient in training to meet the demands of our economy? 100%. But in the meantime, are there ways that we could, if we focus on how we can use those assets to benefit our community? I think there are some ways, and they're not necessarily ones where we require a huge amount of funding or support from the government if we just think about how we leverage those assets differently.
And Terry, you had a question?
So one thing that's kind of bothered me a long time is the sheer amount of gatekeeping that's gone. So thank you for the career apprenticeship program and the idea of getting past this thing where every single hiring manager wants something who's already got previous experience. Because that actually means that nobody ever gets what people don't want.
Right.
And that also, and that you're doing at the university, that also seems to exist to some extent with the trades. And it seems very, very difficult for somebody, for example, who is an arts graduate, and who did that because they wanted to, they went to a university for intellectual reasons.
Yeah.
To then say, well, actually, I also want to do something, like carpentry or being an electrician or being a plumber. You've got to start at ground zero.
Yeah.
At the age of like 30 or 35. But if you're coming out of high school, of course, nobody wants to play that game, and that's one of the reasons. I think that's one of the reasons why we have the shortage. Is there anything we can do about that game? Because I know that it is and that's almost what you're gatekeeping. But other ways we can tackle that problem from both ends.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like there is an increasing amount of funding going into second career, right, or career transition, or how do we move people, especially where they're in pathways that are becoming redundant, or where there isn't a huge amount of opportunity to really elevate themselves out of kind of like core hourly work. I think about groups like Palette Skills, who take people who have kind of mid-career in kind of minimum wage jobs, but have built a huge amount of experience, like potentially managing people or doing sales or whatever, and helping them transition into in-demand fields like technology sales and software sales and things like that. So there are some things that exist for trades specifically, mid-career. It's not an area I've focused on, so I'm not really aware of what's happening there. But I do think one of the biggest wins that we're having when it comes to the trades is really just starting as young as possible, and starting with the parents and helping people understand that these are really great fields for their children to go into. Because we talk about gatekeepers, parents tend to be one of the biggest ones, more for women than men, just because I think there's still some stigma that exists in terms of job selection there. But getting exposure to something like carpentry in the earlier grades, you're more likely to see that as a potential pathway for you than if you never were exposed to it till you graduated university. So that's certainly something that groups like Build a Dream are working hard on and have had some success in.
All right, so thank you very much, Justine.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. I think you've got a pretty good speaker when you've got pretty good questions that get fired.
That's great. Thanks for the question.